showing up today. I think there's still a few more folks that are gonna sort of trickle in here, so we'll give them just a minute to join. But yeah, as Allan and Lucy said, try and keep your microphone muted. If you're starting to experience some bandwidth issues, feel free to cut off your video there while Stevie's presenting. I'm pretty excited to be here today and present, introduce Stevie for his defense. I've gotten to know Stevie quite a bit over the last couple of years, helping advise him through this thesis process. And I know a lot of the folks here have known and worked with Stevie for a number of years as well. So I'm going to present, share the screen here so that I can.
Should I stop sharing?
I think can you see my presentation now?
Can.
Is that in presentation mode?
No, I just see your back.
Your whole desktop.
Oh, the whole desktop.
Let's see. Sorry, I thought I had that.
So guys, real quick, I just chatted to Tim and he said that DNR's bandwidth is currently running at like absolute max. So just as a suggestion, it would probably be good for those that are participating at DNR to not have their video running at any point, because we're currently pretty maxed out on bandwidth here at the Institute. So just as a heads up, sure.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. Yeah, especially while there's not much need to have all the video feeds on. So as I said, many of you have worked with Stevie for a long time. This is in part how I know Stevie here as a really sort of valuable full-time biologist here in the crustacean research and monitoring section. He's been with us since 2014, and often on the boat, setting and pulling crab pots, but that's not the only thing he does. He helps out a lot with lab work, a lot of data analysis, report writing, right? He's an integral and valuable member of the section as a full-time biologist with us. But as my sort of sneak peek there showed a bit ago, he's been with DNR for a number of years. He's been with the CMAP program. This is Stevie as part of the CMAP program. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's one of SCDNR's regular surveys that does offshore sampling and spends many days on the boat at a time. And Stevie had spent some time with that program, and I was able to acquire some of these images of what Stevie was like in some of his earlier days of being with DNR. He's also spent quite a bit of time with the SCORE program, the South Carolina Oyster Restoration Enhancement Program. So just sort of highlighting, some pictures of Stevie as he spent time in DNR. But I think it's also important, and I want to sort of highlight that Stevie is I guess considered a more non-traditional grad student at this stage, right? Even before he came to DNR, he had quite a full and fulfilling life there, as some of the adventures that he's sort of talked to me about as we're out in the field crabbing. Right, summer surfing in Hawaii, international travels with fish, also owning his own commercial crabbing business in Chesapeake Bay. Right, these are all things that Stevie had done not just before grad school, but before he even came to DNR. So he comes to the program here with a lot of background and a lot of experience that has really sort of helped his thesis to develop and become what it is. And that's what brings us today, right? As he's in his master's program here, defending his thesis with environmental and sustainability studies, functionally looking at blue crab population dynamics. And I'm really excited to present Stevie here today for his thesis defense. And I appreciate everyone for joining us here. I'll take this opportunity, as more people have probably joined us. Make sure you go ahead and mute your microphones, but also turn off your video feeds during the presentation if you're signing in through the DNR network, especially. So I'll stop sharing and pass it back over to Stevie here, as he didn't know I was gonna do that to him.
Didn't know. Thank you. Almost shut a creeper.
So go ahead. You can go ahead and reshare your presentation there, Stevie.
All right. Are we good?
Looks good.
All right. I guess it's my turn. Thank you, Dr. Kendrick, for a surprising and wonderful intro. I'm as nervous as I could possibly be right now, but I'm very excited to present with all of you today here my research that I've been working on for the past few years, using long-term survey data to predict blue crab abundance in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. My name is Czwartacki, and I'm part of the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program at the College of Charleston. And without further ado, let's talk about Callinectes sapidus rathbun, whose name derives from the Greek and Latin for the savory, beautiful swimmer, an amazing name. And of course, the rathbun is for Mary Jane Rathbun, who literally wrote the book describing thousands of crustaceans during her time at the Woods Hole Institute and the Smithsonian, where she was director of the Division of Crustacea, although had no formal education, no degrees. So I think any half-hour talk about the blue crab can spare about 30 seconds for once-in-a-generation talent. And I sit underneath of one of her first edition pieces there too. So pretty amazing. Just a quick note before I start, this is a very intimidating species to get into. A lot of research has been done by a lot of brilliant people, and I'm humbled that I got a chance to do some study on this creature. So the blue crab is a decapod crustacean species. It's ubiquitous in the Western Atlantic. It's highly successful at occupying just about every estuarine system from Argentina to Nova Scotia. And it's unfortunately even a successful invader in the Mediterranean, as it's highly invasive there. They're opportunistic, voracious feeders. They're omnivores, and their diets greatly between systems and life stages. They've been shown to be vital in the role of nutrient and energy transfer within the estuarine system, and is both a top benthic predator and a savory prey. And here in South Carolina, they're economically important species. They're economically important species coast-wide, including here in South Carolina, where the blue crab supports one of the largest commercial fisheries in the state. In 2019 alone, 3.9 million pounds of blue crab were landed here in South Carolina, and they have an at-dock value of $5.1 million that year. And that makes a 22% share of South Carolina's total commercial fisheries value, at-dock value in 2019. So it's a pretty large fishery here, and it's a pot-based fishery, and it supports several hundred statewide commercial license holders. So the blue crab begins its life in the high saline waters from the mouth of the estuary, near shore to offshore. And through its zoa and larval stages, it ingresses into the oligo and mesohaline areas of the upper estuary, where it then settles as juveniles in the nursery ground habitat of the lower salinity, upper estuarine, tidal creek salt marsh habitat they prefer in this stage. They grow through several stages of ecdysis, making their way out to the more open water systems of still the upper estuary, lower saline upper estuary, where mating occurs. And then after mating, the catadromous female egresses to the deeper, higher saline areas of the lower estuary again, where her eggs have a greater chance of survival. Now, obviously, mortality occurs as represented by the lowering of numbers in this beautiful animation. And through time, the relationship of juvenile to adult crab abundance is basically the simplest form of explaining population dynamics. Population dynamics refers to how populations of a species change over time, asking what explains average abundance and what causes changes over time. And part of understanding what impacts that change in abundance of organisms within a population is recruitment. And recruitment, which is simply a process where fish or crab transition between two stages of life, including young individuals becoming part of the adult population. Recruitment's a stepwise process from parent to larva, to juvenile, to adult, and back to parent, where essentially abundance at one stage is a function of abundance at a previous stage in its simplest form. So research has shown that variation in blue crab abundance in a year reflects annual variations in recruitment from preceding years. This is called a recruitment stock relationship. And quite simply, the amount of juveniles in one year is related to the amount of adults in later years. And if that all external factors are equal from year to year, it's reasonable to assume with more juveniles, you would see in one year, you would in later years see more adults, and vice versa. So the management of the species occurs on the state level. It's not a region-wide management. It's not a federal management. And on that state level in South Carolina, that is the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources through its Marine Resources Division. The DNR collects data on blue crab and their abundances through a suite of coast-wide fisheries-dependent and independent surveys. And these data are used to inform on the status of the blue crab stock. Fisheries-dependent data are collected from participants of the fishery, crabbers, who report their landings and other data to DNR managers. It's important to note that these data include the amount of crab removed from the ocean or the estuary. And fisheries-independent data are data collected by scientists from long-term monitoring surveys. And these surveys target things like their habitat or environmental factors or even season. And they're planned to be unbiased, unbiased by things like management actions or socioeconomic factors. So one of the products of fisheries-dependent data are landings, or the amounts of fish removed from the system, which can be by weight or by number. And some of those are plotted here in terms of millions of pounds landed on the y-axis through time on the x-axis from 2018 to 2019. And you can see here that blue crab abundance is pretty variable annually from year to year, including years of decline, years of peaks, and you know, region-wide declines and total landings have been reported from the Chesapeake to Florida, including in South Carolina. And you can see here, looking at total landings, that there was a large drop in landings. This is statewide, by the way. There was a large drop in statewide landings from 1998 to 2010, where it, you know, landings peaked at 7.5 million pounds, and 12 short years later, it was under half that at about 3.2 million pounds. So for such an impactful species, it's important to understand why these declines or peaks happen, but mainly it's important to understand what causes this variability through the years. Now, fisheries-independent surveys can help us improve our understanding of these drivers of variability and put an emphasis on the reason for that variation in annual numbers. So the strength of fisheries-independent surveys is in consistent sampling methodologies, like using the same gear deployed for the same amount of time at the same station. And this allows for the development of indices of relative abundance, which are basically an estimate of abundance that can be used to evaluate population trends over time, whether it's increasing, declining, whether it's stable. These indices of abundance are expressed in terms of catch per unit of effort, or CPUE. And that unit of effort will be standardized to the gear. Excuse me, that unit of effort would be standardized to the gear type, trawl time, even season. These fisheries independent CPUEs are an unbiased look at abundance. You know, like I said, the assumption behind a CPUE is that changes in the index are proportional to changes in actual stock and vice versa. So all things being equal, all external factors are equal. If a CPUE drops by 25%, the actual stock of crab drops by 25%. That's a perfect world scenario. And in the ocean, there are not very many perfect world scenarios, but you know, the goal here of these indices of abundance, or CPUEs, is to predict commercial landings, to manage the fishery based on observed recruitment, basically. I'll be using the terms index of abundance, relative abundance, catch per unit of effort, CPUE, kind of interchangeably through this presentation, and I apologize for that. But I'm essentially meaning the same thing with all these terms, that it's a relative abundance relative to the metric of effort. So my research objectives for the project were to, one, test correlation in adult blue crab abundances between surveys. How related are these adult abundances and their variations from survey to survey? And I want to test for correlation between total pounds landed and fishing effort. What's the relationship there? Is there a drive in that variation of total pounds landed? And by total pounds landed, I mean total sum pounds, not a unit of effort. And is there a relationship between those total pounds and total fishing effort? How many pots were put out? How many hours were fished? Some metric of effort. And then I want to model time-lagged relationships from monitoring surveys. So some initial methods, some of these are characteristics that could interfere with the success of the study. Some initial methods are employed to reach my objectives were subsetting all of this to Charleston Harbor watershed only sites. Blue crab are known to vary between estuarine systems. We see varying abundances, varying patterns of use of estuaries between the Chesapeake and Albemarle Sound and Charleston Harbor. And it's reasonable to assume we would see that same variability between Charleston and St. Helena, or Charleston and Port Royal. So I wanted to subset this to a smaller Charleston watershed only. And I wanted to generate indices of relative abundance, specifically for some of the size and life history stages of blue crab in these surveys. And then I wanted to develop a survey inclusion criteria. So CPUE, what am I talking about? Size, sex, maturity data, they're all collected as part of these sampling surveys in situ. And I want to generate life stage specific CPUEs. Size is a measure of the tip from the 9th lateral spine to the 9th lateral spine, or simply the carapace width of the blue crab. And you can see the categories here: adult, subadult, juvenile. Juvenile crab, it's kind of an industry standard. 60 millimeters and below is a juvenile crab outside of its post-larval stages. An adult crab simply means the legal size. Now this legal size, 127 millimeters or 5 inches. It's about where we can expect crab to start to mature. But it's also a round 5-inch number that helps crabbers to say legal, unlegal. So it's not necessarily a mature, sexually mature adult, but it's reasonable to assume that a lot of them are mature, sexually mature. But instead of saying legal size, I'm referring to adult sized. And it's important to note that these adults from fisheries-independent surveys are or should be the same size as commercial landings, since that is the legal limit. I wanted to generate CPUEs for sex. Blue crab are sexually dimorphic. You have in this picture here a mature female crab on the left and a mature male crab on the right. Mature male crab, as we said in the Chesapeake formerly, they look like the Washington Monument. And of course, the female mature crab looks like the Capitol Rotunda. And I wanted to look at maturity. And these will be combined into sex maturity factors: mature male, mature female, immature female. A maturity is determined in situ also by the shape of the abdomen. The top picture is a immature female with a pyramid design on her abdomen. The Capitol Rotunda, mature female on the bottom. And male crab were determined mature in situ by how their abdomen peels from their abdomen, how their abdomen peels off. So if it peels, we're considering it mature. If it doesn't, we're considering it immature. And that's pretty standard practice for in the field. So what do these surveys look like? here, the next few slides are going to be very similar. It's just some overview of the surveys employed. This is showing crab reporting areas for fisheries-dependent or commercial landings. These are landings that are reported to the Office of Fisheries Management here by the fishery, by the participants, crabbers. And although landings go further back than 1980, our fisheries-independent data sets really begin to in 1980. So I subset all landings data from 1980 to 2018. That's our research time period. This commercial landings, when I refer to them, I'm referring to total pounds landed, sum total pounds landed. And that's an aggregate of all 4 of these reporting areas. Commercial LPUE, this is a new term that I'm dropping on you. And this is simply to distinguish the commercial aspect. This is a per unit of effort metric also, where pots pooled is our effort metric. So the data on effort began being collected in 2004, so it's only a 14-year data set. And it also has total pounds landed, and we're describing that per unit of effort by dividing total pounds landed by the amount of pots pooled. So total for the four reporting areas divided by total pots pooled for the 4 reporting areas. On to the fisheries independent surveys. This is the Ashley potting survey. The data set goes from 1988 to 2018. This is a monthly survey that occurs once in October and once in November. And it's a randomized block, but the site itself is only 2,500 meters, so kind of consider it a fixed site. And there's some size data from this. Sex and maturity were taken in a way that we weren't able to include them in these analyses. So it does have some size. And I say some size because if you look at the picture, that's a crab pot and it is size selective. Crab pots are not catching juvenile crab. They come in, they come out. It's a 1.5 inch mesh size. So basically anything below 90 millimeters is excluded. The next survey is the Creek Trawl survey. This survey has a 1980 to 2018 data set as well. These are 7 fixed station sites that are sampled monthly from May to September. So it's a summertime seasonal survey in which a small trawl net is pulled through very shallow waters and tidal creeks and in the Wando and Ashley River systems. And there are size, sex, and maturity data included in this data set. Next up, we have the Estuarine Trawl survey. This is a monthly fixed station, year-round survey with 4 fixed stations in the Ashley River and Charleston Harbor. There's also size, sex, and maturity data. And this data set goes from 1980 to 2018. The SCECAP trawl survey. The SCECAP trawl survey, this is one tiny component, the biological trawl survey, of a much larger statewide survey. This data set goes from 1999 to 2018. SCECAP, by the way, stands for the South Carolina Estuarine and Coastal Assessment Program. So it's a wonderful program. And there is size and sex information, but not maturity information for this data set. And the SCECAP data set is essentially 2 parts. It's a tidal creek and an open water trawl survey. And then finally, last but not least, the Trammel Net Survey. And the Trammel Net Survey's data set goes from 2006 to 2018. This is a monthly random stratified sampling design. There are 3 strata: Charleston Harbor, Lower Wando, Lower Ashley, and up to 12 sites per strata are chosen monthly. So quite a lot of sampling from this survey. But the survey did not start collecting info on size, sex, or maturity until recently. And I decided to go with total abundance for the survey for the longer term nature of the data set. So I think it's safe to say that there is quite a lot of spatial and temporal coverage of the blue crab and its various habitats that it uses throughout its life history stages. These 5 or 6 surveys, however you want to look at them, they've got this Charleston Harbor watershed covered pretty well. So I'm pretty excited. So some survey inclusion criteria. These are pretty standard in the stock assessment world. Thank you to Joey Ballenger for including these for me and turning me on to these. I've set these inclusion criteria as a positive rate of individual collections, 5%. If a survey did not collect crab in 5% of their sampling and of their unit of effort, of their pots put out or of their trawls, then I'm going to exclude it from these analyses. Minimum number of crabs encountered per year, over 30. A minimum length of time series, 10 years, and is the survey performed annually? So unfortunately, I excluded SCECAP survey from any further analyses. I'm pretty bummed about that because of the random stratified design. Offered the opportunity to cover quite a lot of, you know, and a different approach to a lot of our fixed stations. So it added something a little different. It also did not collect any samples in 2008, and the Tidal Creeks portion didn't collect any samples in 4 other years. So we're not going to talk about SCECAP through these analyses. So just to refresh, for research objectives and how I plan to implement some methodology to test for these, I want to test for correlation in adult crab abundances between surveys. And I'm going to employ a Pearson correlation coefficient for that. I want to test for correlation between total pounds landed and our fishing effort metric of pots pulled. And I'm also going to use a Pearson correlation coefficient for that. And I want to model time-lagged relationships from monitoring surveys using ordinary least squares regression. So I want to emphasize, again, about this time lag. And I'm going to mention a lag several times in this presentation. I want to make it very clear. I want you to understand that I'll be using survey life history CPUEs from a given year as an independent variable in these regression models to explain the CPUEs and commercial data from later or antecedent years. So 2018 juveniles predicting 2019 and 2020 adults. Now I'm going to model predictive relationships where one life history stage CPUEs from these fishery-independent surveys predict that same survey's adult abundance CPUEs in following years using OLS. And I'm also going to predict commercial landings in a given year using those fishery-independent CPUEs that I've created. So this is adult CPUEs within a survey by that survey's own lagged life stage CPUEs, and then commercial landings by all fisheries independent survey life history stage CPUEs lagged by a year or two. I hope that I explained that well. So test for correlation and adult crab abundances between surveys. I did this by correlating the long-term trends in blue crab abundance. Sorry, my trigger finger got a little crazy there. This is a time series plot of commercial landings data from the Charleston Harbor aggregated reporting areas. And you can see, and I'll orient you to this, on the Y, we have the total pounds landed, and on the X over time, 1980 to 2020, that black line is the mean annual total pounds landed. And that dotted black line is the long-term mean, or the series mean, from 1980 to 2020. And that blue line there is a low S smoothing function that's going to help us visualize a trend in this kind of noisy data set that we have here. So, so this is commercial landings and total pounds landed. And these are total pounds landed with our unit of effort. So I'm going to walk you through time series here of all these surveys now. Landings per unit of effort, or landings per pot. It's again, only a data set from 2004 to 2018. But you can see that the variation is a little less. This is the Ashley River Potting Survey. This is adult catch per pot on the y-axis plotted over time from 1988 to 2018 on the X. And again, and what you're seeing there in the shaded area is a confidence interval representing 95%. So variability in that mean annual. So, you know, this is the one survey at first glance, it looks like there's a decline in abundance, but the survey, there may be an alternative explanation. Declines in abundance could be an artifact of this survey taking place through a time of high migration. This fall survey kind of targets that season of migration. So yes, it looks like a decline, but it may not be quite a decline in blue crab abundance. So I wanted to put that out there if you're looking at it going, wow, crab abundance has really dropped. This is the creek trawl time series, 1980 to 2018. Again, adult crab per trawl on the y-axis over time on the X from 1980 to 2018. That black line of the mean annual number, the shaded being the 95% confidence interval, the dotted black line being the long-term mean, and that blue being the visual smoother, the visual trend line. You know, a lot of annual variability, just like every other survey we've looked at. You know, and then the next is the Estuarine Trawl survey. Again, a lot of annual variability. These are adult blue crab, to remind you, and this is adult crab caught per trawl. So this is not all crab caught in the survey. We're simply looking at the time series of adults. Again, you know, one thing we're seeing in every survey is high annual variability. This is the Trammel Net Survey. Again, high annual variability. Adult catch per set over time on the X. So this is all of those together just to get us looking at some of these trends. You know, how do these long-term trends in adult legal size crab correlate between surveys? And there's a general lack of trend between the surveys. There's a general lack of trend between adult blue crab from 6 different surveys that we're looking at here. Although there are relationships between Trammel Net and Estuarine Trawl, and the Trammel Net and the landings per unit of effort. Now, there were 15 tests performed and only 2 did we find a relationship, and I'll go through those relationships here. The first, between the Estuarine Trawl and the Trammel Net survey, now there's a big difference here in that I'm showing a time series of adults from the Estuarine Trawl survey and a time series of total CPUE, remember, from the Trammel Net survey. And if you remember, only total abundance data are for blue crab were collected until recently, but using the total CPUE will give us an opportunity to use longer term data set. But the gear employed as part of the survey is probably size selective, and the sampling area and the open water areas of the estuary, I think, make it reasonable to assume that larger sized adult crab are caught as part of this survey. Trammel Net also correlates with landings, LPUE. The Trammel Net surveys, again, the sampling area of the Trammel Net covers pretty well the 4 crab reportings, and this may have something to do with the stronger relationship that we're seeing. And by the way, both of those, the first Trammel Net Estuarine Trawl correlation had about 0.62 or 62% of the variation linking up, or that long-term trend linking up, being related. So pretty strong relations. Now, these surveys occur through a broad range of habitats known to be important at different life stages in a crab's lives, and through a range of seasons that are integral to crab growth and development. So it's not surprising that some of the long-term trends in the survey are not related. These results could mean that some surveys are better than others at catching adult crab, or the results could mean that adult populations respond to something differently, but that's not what we should take away from this. Simply that trends in long-term adult CPUEs and their variation from these surveys, for whatever reason, do not agree, or for the most part are different. So my objective 2, which as a reminder is to correlate total landings and an effort metric. And just to remind you, that effort metric is landings per unit of effort, and that is total pots pooled. So again, here are the commercial landings. These are total pounds landed, but also to remind you, our fishing data began being collected in 2004. So our analyses here will take place on this portion of the landings time series. And this is those landings on the top plot, total pounds landed on the Y over time on the X for the Charleston Harbor watershed, and fishing effort, or pots pooled, the number of pots pooled over time from 2004 to 2018 on the bottom. And if you can't tell already, they are strongly related. So those trends do match up quite well. And you know, when we're looking at, sorry to flip through slides here, we're looking at this variability in commercial landings. It's quite different than the variability in landings per unit of effort. And I think that that's important. My third research objective was to model time-lagged relationships for monitoring surveys. I wanted to do this using the ordinary least squares method, where our fisheries-independent CPUEs time-lagged are predicting the fisheries-independent adult CPUEs, or the fisheries-independent CPUEs time-lagged are predicting the commercial landings, whether it's total pounds landed or landings per unit of effort. And that, again, is, in its simplest form, wanting to look for a relationship between adult crab and juvenile or subadult crab from preceding years. So what did we find? As dependent variables on this left here, and CPUE would be any of our fisheries independent adult CPUEs, landings or total pounds landed, and landings per unit of effort. Did we find anything? The really hot issue is, can these juveniles predict these adults, or can these juveniles predict landings? And in our fisheries independent surveys, no fisheries independent survey has had their own adults predicted by juveniles. Total landings cannot have their adults predicted by juveniles. But landings per unit of effort, there is a relationship I found between creek trawl juveniles from antecedent years and landings per unit of effort. And let's look at that relationship here. It's not the strongest relationship. 29% of the annual variation in adult landings per unit of effort is explained by creek trawl juveniles from the year before. You know, it's there, it's a relationship, it's not the strongest. So what about our other predictive models from fisheries independent surveys? Can any other life stage, subadult, can an immature female predict adults from fisheries independent surveys? And they can, sorry. And over the next few slides, I don't want you to camp out so much on the values or look at which ones are predicting. I want you to see that there's a relationship that yes, there is one survey that can predict its adults using adults from 1 and 2 years before, but there are also weak relationships. And this is the only survey where we found those relationships. Total landings as a dependent variable being predicted by these fisheries independent CPUEs, only 2 relationships, both very weak. One, adults from with a 2-year lag from the potting survey can explain 25% of the variation in total landings. And mature males with a 1-year lag can explain 10% of the variation in total landings. Again, weak relationships. And then with landings per unit of effort as a dependent variable, you get a little bit stronger relationships, and you get quite a lot. The creek trawl survey has 6 6 indices that do have relationships where a lagged life history stage can predict landings per unit of effort. The Estuarine trawl with the strongest relationship that I found at all, of 43% of landings per unit of effort variation being explained by mature males from the previous year. And of course, there's 3 relationships that I found predicting LPUE from using the Estuarine trawl. So what does this mean? You know, long-term trends in adults from survey to survey are generally not related. And I think this highlights the importance of sampling a wide array of estuarine habitats through several seasons. I think this is backed up by how poor these fisheries-independent surveys perform when predicting their own adult abundances. Some of these surveys offer different relationships between different life history stages to CPUEs that I think should be explored further through modeling. Interactions between some of these CPUEs could improve our understanding of blue crab population dynamics. Variation in annual total landings and their peaks and their declines are strongly related to variation in annual fishing effort and should be considered when we predict blue crab commercial landings in South Carolina. This also has strong management implications in that if you adjust the effort through management, annual variation will be affected. Time-lagged relationships do exist between commercial landings per unit of effort, but they consistently predict only about 1/3 to under half of the adult variability. You know, I think improvements can be made by the fisheries-independent indices by possibly adjusting some of the variables. You know, we can adjust. The Estuarine trawl, for example, looks at the Ashley and the Charleston Harbor system. Maybe we can use that to predict only the 2 reporting areas. But you know, these are similar. Oh goodness, these are similar results to other areas. The Chesapeake's commercial landings are forecasted through using integrated survey CPUEs. The Chesapeake uses an integrated juvenile trawl survey and overwintering mature female survey to predict and forecast their commercial landings. We may be able to integrate some of our survey CPUEs to make an integrated index that can forecast landings one day. But I think it's pretty clear that there are some other drivers of adult blue crab abundance in South Carolina. You know, improvements could be made in our variation and integrated indices of abundance across several surveys, especially the Estuarine trawl and the creek trawl survey. They should be explored further, especially to see if we can improve our prediction of variation. But any index using fishery-independent CPUE may not go far enough to explain variation in adults to forecast landings. This includes using environmental variables to predict, to predict some of that annual variation. I think it would be worth it to start looking at the drive of things like salinity and temperature and see how they describe annual variation in blue crab abundance. Even long-term indices of salinity or long-term indices of temperature to see how they describe or how they explain variation in annual adult abundance. And I think after considering putting integrated indices together, after possibly putting in environmental variables, that we need to explore non-parametric modeling of variation in abundance. You know, there's clearly a relationship between abundances from year to year, but this research doesn't investigate factors like autocorrelation or cross-correlation or seasonality, and that could affect estimation error. And many of these surveys have overlap between some of the independent variables too. So in conclusion, long-term trends in adult blue crab abundances from monitoring surveys are generally not related. Long-term trends in landings are strongly related to long-term trends in fishing effort. And fisheries-independent CPUEs can only explain so much of their own adult variation, but they do better when explaining landings per unit of effort. And I think that future models should incorporate integrated indices of abundance from several surveys and environmental and habitat, and possibly climate variables, and maybe explore non-parametric methodologies. So with that, I've reached the end almost. I'd like to acknowledge quite a lot of folks. My thesis advisor, Dr. Michael Kendrick, you've been a mentor, and I really appreciate all the hard work and walking me through science and modeling and what some of this stuff means. My academic advisor, Allan Strand, is same to you, the same thing. That goes for my thesis committee. I feel blessed to have this group of people as my committee, and I think they're about to grill me in 10 minutes, and I'm looking forward to it, because these 4 people are making me a better scientist. A special thank you to Dr. Peter Kingsley Smith. I was on a job interview for my current job, and he asked me if I had any questions, and I said, yes, can I go to graduate school? And I got about 2 words into that, and he said, yes, done. So thank you. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I realize it, and I would not be here without you. The Greater Crustacean Research and Monitoring Section, Jeff Brunson, Kristen Hamilton, Elizabeth Gooding, Jeanette Huber, Daniel Sasson, and past and present members of the Estuarine Finfish section who have caught quite a lot of crab on their survey. The Ecological Research section, especially Dr. Denise Sanger, and the Greater Shellfish Research section. I'm going to thank the Office of Fisheries Management and Erik for the data from the dependent side, from the fisheries dependent side, and the EVSS program, Dr. Annette Watson and Miss Lucy Davis as well, and Brooke and Andy Czwartacki, you're my rock. I wouldn't have been able to do this without you. The Greater Czwartacki clan, Rick, Lou, Patrick, and Tracy, and of course the funding sources for these surveys, the Ashley Potting Survey and the Creek Trawl Survey funded by Morgan Island Programmatic Income, the Estuarine Trawl funded by the South Carolina Saltwater Recreational Fishing License Funds, SCECAP funded by Dingle Johnson Funds, which are from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and the Trammel Net Survey from the National Marine Fisheries Service and SCDNR. And with that, we'll take questions. Thank you.
So to ask questions, remind you, you can use the hands up feature under the participants, or use the chat. I see a chat right now. Tons of chats coming in, congratulating. But you could also ask a question using that venue as well.
Thank you everyone for sitting through this and learning about the blue crab. I hope I did it justice.
You did. Nice job, Stevie. I'll sort of defer to the audience. We'll get some audience questions in, and then we'll come back to the committee and have the committee ask their questions. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat there.
Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Stevie, nice presentation.
Thanks, Mike.
I'm really intrigued by the smooth line from the 80s across the decades. It looks a lot like what we see with the sea turtle nesting, which has been linked association-wise with the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, lagged 30 years because of their life history. Obviously, blue crabs are much more R-selected. I don't think this is a predator-prey thing. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I'm wondering, has anybody looked at environmental associations and in particular with emphasis on what the impact is on age at maturity? Obviously they mature early, but is there enough variation that if that were linked to the environmental index, that it could be setting up these oscillations?
So that's a great question. This this research was originally going to incorporate things like the ONSI or the ONSI and the ENSO, some of these larger climatic indices, and in particular some other indices like long-term indices of salinity and temperature. And I'm not aware if anybody's looked at that yet. We do have a grad student, Michael Fines, who's looking at kind of some beginning growth stuff. And I think Mike, I can't speak to it very well, but I think Mike probably can. But yes, there does seem to be, and I did not include this in research, and I have no statistical proof, but there does seem to be a cycle, whether that's a decadal cycle or not, I'm not aware. You know, and at the end of the day, it probably needs 100 more years of data before we can really say, hey, there's this quantifiable relationship that we're seeing. But I don't think that's outside of the realm of possibility. I think that that's on the radar of pretty much every program studying crab today. And yeah, it's a great question. I think that, you know, and what I show basically, and I hope my take home message is that, you know, we're not predicting adult abundance very well. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it's certainly not because we don't have enough sampling going on. It's, you know, we have quite a lot of data, quite a lot of coverage. I think that there is other drivers, you know, and blue crab are hugely responsive to environmental drivers, both day to day and through survivability, especially to salinity, and climate should interact with that greatly, I would think. But, you know, I hope I answered some of that.
Daniel, go ahead and unmute and give it a shot.
Thanks. Great job, Stevie.
Thank you.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here to ask you a question.
Bring it.
So you showed that the monitoring surveys don't correlate with landings, and they also generally don't correlate super well with each other in many of the cases. So my question would be, what do you think the value of these monitoring surveys are?
Well, first and foremost, you need fisheries independent sampling to suss out some of that economic driver in landings per unit of effort or total landings. You know, that our crab fishery, a lion's share of the crab go out of state, and there are market forces at play. You know, is the Chesapeake buying our crab, and how much, and is it worth it to go crab? You know, I think that these surveys are, I suspect that these surveys are measuring the population pretty well. What I don't think they're catching, and what you know, looking at them survey by survey, is how to quantify some of these trends appropriately. And so I think that if you integrate some of these surveys, if you integrate some of these CPUEs, if we take a look at things like growth at maturity, take a look at things like when did the juveniles recruit, and we kind of calibrate these a little better and then integrate them. That's typically what's done in other areas as part of their stock assessments. And I think that we can do that. I think that we can take, you know, immature males from the year before from the creek trawl, and I think that we can probably integrate them with mature males from the Estuarine trawl and do a better job of describing them. So I think there's high value in these surveys. These surveys are, you know, this isn't a red drum. The red drum is hanging out in areas that, and I'm not a red drum guy, so I'm probably talking strong fallacies right now, but I picture blue crab dispersing throughout every area of the estuary. And maybe some years they survive a little better over here with these conditions. And maybe some years they survive a little better over in these conditions. And when you add to that the family level of life history stage and their egress from those habitats that support that, and then more interaction, I think that these surveys can show that. You know, and without multiple surveys, we're not going to be able to sample multiple parts of habitats that are important to their life history stages. You know, without the creek trawl survey, you know, we're not going to be able to go after juvenile crab in their nursery ground habitat. The surface of the marsh is just simply not going to be able to be habitated or sampled easily. You know, so I think that looking at these surveys holistically as kind of parts to a whole when talking about blue crab is you know, probably where their importance come in. I hope that answered your question too.
Jeff Brunson's got his hand up. Maybe he has a question.
Mr. Brunson.
Hey, Stevie, great job.
Thank you.
So in your Asti River potting figure, the abundance, annual abundance trend figure, you made mention that you weren't convinced that that was indicating a decline in abundance, and then you said something about that migration may be a factor here. Can you sort of clarify what you mean by that?
Yeah, and I apologize. I ripped through this area quite a lot and probably said some things and opened up worms that I wasn't looking to. But the survey samples in a time of year known for high seasonal migration of the male crab. The male crab hangs out in the fresher portions of the estuary. And at some point, temperatures drop or freshwater inflows like hurricanes come, and it pushes them out of those freshwater areas into the deeper channels of the lower, more saline areas. So this survey is essentially looking at, did this egress happen? You know, is this egress happening? So the decline here, taken with all that information, you look at it and say, yeah, there's like a decline going on, right? I see it. It goes from 4 in 1980, four crab per pot to, 1.5 in 2018. That's a decline. But I think with that information, maybe that's not quite showing a decline in crab population. Maybe that's showing crab moving out of those areas at different times, or crab moving out of those areas differently. Maybe they're not moving out during events. Maybe they're moving out over large windows of time. I don't have the answers for that, but I suspect that that's what's being shown in this survey. You know, it's undeniable that the blue line goes down, but relative to what also? I mean, is it really going down from 2000 on? And is there a shift? Is it decadal? So I think there's a lot of questions that this kind of proposes.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
So that seems reasonable, but it's a pretty long and steady decline, which would suggest that, maybe there are some longer term environmental or climatic drivers to this trend. If what you're suggesting is that it's not necessarily an abundance decrease.
So can't rule that out by looking at this, right? But I think maybe what the suggestion is, so this survey is part of a greater coast-wide survey, and it occurs in 6 estuaries, and each one has a relative index to itself. And maybe one way of looking at that is to look at those 6 portions of this survey, the Ashley potting survey, the Dahu potting survey, the Whale Branch potting survey, and to see how well those trends line up. Now, I would expect if those trends lined up, then yeah, maybe it's supporting, oh, look, there's maybe possibly a migration shift, but I don't think that there's enough here to make that claim. I think what you see here is that in October and November, from 1988 to 2018, adult crab per pot have dropped. And that's it. It is during a season of migration. There's a very visible drop, but we're making quite broad claims based on little information, I think. But there's room there to answer some of those questions, I think, particularly with this survey.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Stevie.
Yeah.
It looks like Peter has a question, has his hand up.
Hey, Stevie, nice job.
Peter, thank you.
Absolutely. I might have missed this and you may have just left out this level of detail just in the interest of brevity, but so for the Estuarine Trawl survey that occurs monthly year round, when you did the comparisons or the regressions or the correlations between the Estuarine Trawl survey and some other metrics, did you only look at that on a annual average to annual average basis, or did you consider looking at like a particular time point within the year and look at those regressions? Like, so trying to identify a time point within the year where perhaps for a particular size class, like let's say adult males, they happen to be particularly prevalent at that time of year in the trawl survey, and pinpoint that time point and compare it to the other metrics, as opposed to using sort of an annual sort of integrated average. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I did not. I used, so basically when I compared Estuarine Trawl survey adult CPUEs, I compared that annual data set, that monthly annual data set, to the summertime seasonal data set of the creek trawl, or the fall data set of the Ashley Potting survey. And I think there's room for some calibration in there. You know, certainly you can take that data from the same time period and compare. But I think this was an initial analysis. You know, basically this is a good starting point. You know, now to take this and say, let's see if they really compare. Let's see if these months compare. Let's see if and this is where the non-parametric modeling might come into play. Let's see if there's seasonality in the data. Let's see if you know, a 0 in January is not the same thing as a 0 in July, and let's see if that, you know, if there's differences there too. So no, I did not. I just simply did the survey's total adult CPUE for the whole time period. That's a good question.
Thank you.
It looks like that's all the questions from the audience.
Yeah.
So we appreciate